The Fletcher 2100 is the choice of professionals. It has earned the reputation of a quality machine engineered to produce the mats that enhance your customers' artwork and demonstrate your creativity. This video will show you how to use the winning features of the Fletcher 2100 and its optional accessories. The key elements of the Fletcher 2100 are base, mat guide, cutting head, blade magazine, mat stop, mat guide slide, clamp, clamp handle, locator pin, mat gauge, and squaring blocks. In addition, there are optional features: measuring stops, upper and lower, angle mat guide, squaring arm, base plate, and clamp lifters. Very little setup is required because the machine is packed fully assembled and adjusted prior to shipment. Cut the plastic tie wrap which secures the cutting head. Tip the machine over and apply the rubber bumpers from the parts bag to the bottom so the machine will not slide or mar a tabletop. Do not remove the two rubber bumpers under the clamp. Place the Fletcher 2100 on a firm, flat tabletop and position it so you can stand at the lower end. It should be high enough so you don't have to bend your back too much. There should be adequate table surface to the right of the machine, free of obstructions, and to the left, so the mat guide locking strap and mat guide slide do not overhang the table. Take the mat gauge and locator pin from the parts bag and place them in the storage hole in the base so they are available for use. The blade magazine is a unique feature of the Fletcher 2100. It permits you to safely install blades in the cutting head. There are two blade magazines, one cutting vertically and the other at an angle to produce a beveled edge. Handle blades carefully. They are very sharp and can cause severe cuts. To install a blade, loosen the magazine locking knob and withdraw the magazine from the cutting head. Slide a blade into the magazine, being careful not to dull the corner of the blade entering the magazine. Push the blade in until it touches the depth adjusting screw. Slide the magazine back into the head as far as it will go, and tighten the magazine locking knob, which secures both the magazine and the blade depth setting. All cutting is done with a piece of mat board under the mat being cut. This is known as a slip sheet or underlayment, and should be about 8 inches wide and 40 to 50 inches long. The slip sheet will assure a sharp, crisp edge to the cut. Move it around as you cut mats and replace the slip sheet when it becomes ragged. It is important to replace the blade when it becomes dull, rather than risk ruining a valuable mat. It is difficult to be precise about how many mats you can cut with a blade because it will vary by type of mat board, slip sheet, how the machine is cared for, and technique. You may be able to cut 5 to 10 mats between blade changes. However, many experienced mat cutters will replace a blade before it shows evidence of being worn. You should verify the blade cutting depth is correct for the thickness of the mat you are using. Place 2 pieces of mat under the clamp. Slide the head beyond the mats and apply modest pressure on the clamp handle. Rotate the bevel cutting assembly as far as it goes. Hold the blade fully rotated while pulling the head toward you. After passing the lower edge of the mats, release the blade assembly. Lift the clamp handle and remove the mats. Verify that the cut fully penetrated the first mat and only partially entered the second mat. Bend this second mat to determine the depth of cut in the slip sheet. The proper position of the blade can be adjusted by removing the magazine and changing the position of the blade depth screw. Push the blade against this screw before reinstalling the magazine. Let's cut a simple vertical mat 11 by 14 with 3-inch borders on all 4 sides. This will produce an opening of 5 by 8 inches. Loosen both the lower and upper mat guide locking knobs. Place the locator pin in the 4th hole from the right on the slide. Slide the mat guide to the right until it rests against the locator pin, and tighten the lower locking knob before tightening the upper locking knob. Notice the indicator on the mat guide is lined up with 3 inches on the scale. When positioning the mat guide, always tighten the lower locking knob first, then the upper one. Tightening the lower locking knob will align the mat guide as well as tighten it. The upper locking knob may not be required on small mats, but the mat guide will be more secure if both are tightened. Cutting openings is always done from the back of the mat. Raise the clamp handle slightly and slide the mat board, upside down, under the clamp and tight against the mat guide. Then lower the clamp handle. Be sure the slip sheet is under the mat board. Use a sharp pencil and draw a fine line along the left edge of the clamp. Raise the clamp handle enough to rotate the mat board 90 degrees and reposition it against the mat guide. Lower the clamp handle and draw another pencil line the same way as the first line. Repeat the penciling of the remaining 2 lines so that all 4 sides are marked. These pencil lines will be used to determine where to start and stop the cuts. With the left edge of the mat board firmly against the mat guide, press down on the clamp handle and position the head so the bevel cutting blade can be rotated and the tip of the blade will enter the mat about 3/16 of an inch beyond the upper pencil line. Keep downward pressure on the clamp handle and the blade fully rotated while you pull the head toward the lower pencil line at a steady, moderate speed. Stop the cut when the index mark nearest the tip of the magazine aligns with the lower pencil line. Release the blade pivot and be sure it returns to its upward position. Now you can raise the clamp handle slightly and rotate the mat board 90 degrees and place it against the mat guide again. Cut this border as you did the first one. Rotate the mat board and cut 2 more times to complete the mat opening. Raise the clamp and remove the mat board. The cutout piece, known as the fallout, should be completely separated, and the mat is finished. Examine the front of the mat carefully, particularly the 4 corners. Each cut should be perfectly straight. If it curves at the start, it is called hooking and is undesirable. Several conditions may cause hooking. The blade may be dull, the head may be out of adjustment, we will explain this later, you may not be pressing downward forcefully enough on the pivot, or the blade may be extended too far out of the magazine. If the fallout was not completely separated, you did not cut far enough into the corner. This is called undercutting and is undesirable. By carefully studying the incomplete cut, you can determine if it occurred at the beginning or the end of a cut. If at the end of the cut, change the stopping position of the index mark on the magazine with respect to the lower pencil line. Finish the incomplete cut by hand with a spare blade. If at the start, alter your judgment of the 3/16 inch beyond the upper pencil line. If you see a cut extending beyond a corner, it is called overcutting and is unsightly. Overcutting can also be corrected by changing the way you judge the position of the blade with respect to the pencil lines. Undercutting and overcutting are best controlled by practice and by developing a consistent technique. Measuring stops, which are available as an option, eliminate the need to draw pencil lines for starting and stopping cuts and assure that over and undercutting are consistently controlled from mat to mat. Place the upper measuring stop over the shaft with the locking knob to the right. The lower measuring stop will be positioned over the shaft with its locking knob to the right also. The cutting head will be operated between the upper and lower stops. Let's use a mat to adjust the measuring stops. Put the locator pin in the second hole from the right for a 2-inch border and slide the mat guide against the pin. Lock the lower locking knob, then the upper one. Place the mat upside down on the slip sheet. Slide the mat to the left against the mat guide and draw a short line near the bottom. Rotate the mat 90 degrees clockwise and draw another line near the top, crossing the first line. Slide the upper measuring stop toward the mat while pressing the spring button down. When the button touches the mat, lock the upper measuring stop in this position. Set the upper measuring stop scale bar to the top border width, 2 inches in this case, and lock it with its locking knob. Start with the cutting head against the stop screw in the upper measuring stop. Rotate the bevel cutting blade. The tip of the blade should touch the mat about 3/16 of an inch above the pencil line. If necessary, loosen the stop screw locking nut and reposition the stop screw. Rotate the blade fully into the mat and make a cut 1 or 2 inches long. Lift the clamp handle, rotate the mat 90 degrees counterclockwise, and slide it against the mat guide and mat stop. The mat stop must be used with the lower measuring stop. Position the lower measuring stop with its upper edge in line with 2 inches on the scale on top of the clamp. Start a cut in the middle of the mat and stop when the index mark closest to the tip of the magazine is in line with the lower pencil line. Adjust the stop screw to stop the head at this point. Carefully examine the corner from the front. A very slight overcut is required to separate the fallout, but it should be barely noticeable. Undercutting or excessive overcutting should be corrected by readjusting the stop screws. You can use 1 or more of the remaining 3 corners of the mat to test your adjustments. Once you verify that the measuring stops are correctly set, be sure to tighten the stop screw locking nuts firmly. It is easier to do this if you remove the measuring stops from the shaft. These adjustments of the measuring stops require that the machine be square, and the mat must also be square. If the mat thickness changes, the blade depth must change, and the measuring stops will need to be readjusted. Each time you rotate the mat, recheck the spring button position. A double mat is easy to produce, and with its contrasting colors can highlight the artwork more effectively than a single mat. The outer or top mat will be cut first, then adhered to the inner mat. The outer mat will be sized 16 by 20 and will be about 1/4 inch larger than the inner mat, so its edges will determine the location of all cuts. This way, we can be sure the borders will be parallel and uniform. In this example, let's make 3-inch borders in the outer mat. Mark the back of the outer mat with a line which you will use to orient the fallout later. Cut the outer mat first. Insert the locator pin in the 4th hole from the right in the mat guide slide. Slide the mat guide against the locator pin and lock it in place at 3 inches. Position the outer mat upside down under the clamp, against the mat guide, and down against the mat stop. Be sure the slip sheet is in place under the mat. Slide the upper measuring stop toward the mat while depressing the spring button as you did before. Lock the upper measuring stop when the button touches the mat. Now slide the upper measuring stop bar to read 3 inches on its scale and lock it on the upper measuring stop. Set the lower measuring stop at 3 inches also. Proceed to cut the 4 sides of the outer mat. Remove it and set the fallout aside. Place the outer mat face down on the table and apply adhesive such as ATG just outside the opening of all 4 sides. Lay the inner mat upside down on the outer mat with all 4 edges inside the 4 edges of the outer mat. Turn the mats over facing up and apply ATG adhesive to the face of the inner mat. Be sure you do not apply it within 3/16 of an inch of the outer mat. Position the fallout in the opening of the outer mat oriented as it was originally. Both mats and the fallout are now adhered together. Set the mat guide at 3 3/16. Insert the locator pin in the mat gauge and in the 4th hole in the mat guide slide. Turn the mat gauge so the edge labeled 3/16 is on the left. Slide the mat guide against the mat gauge and lock it. Place the assembled mats against the mat guide and the mat stop. Notice that the outer mat is touching the mat guide and mat stop because its edges protrude beyond the inner mat. Reset both measuring stops to 3 3/16 inches. Cut the 4 sides of the inner mat. Notice the spring button is checked each time the mats are turned. Turn the mats over and you will see the attractive double mat. If you wished to make a triple mat, you would size the third mat the same as the second to assure that the location of the mats while bevel cutting will be determined by the larger outer mat. Keep in mind also, the final opening for the artwork will be created in the last or innermost mat. A V-groove around the opening is an easy way to add a dramatic touch to your matting. We will show two techniques to produce a V-groove with the Fletcher 2100. The V-groove must be of uniform width and the corners should be clean and sharp. In the first technique, mark the back of the mat with a pencil so you can insert the fallout back into the mat in the same original position. Decide how far the V-groove will be from the opening. This is an aesthetic decision and depends somewhat on the overall size of the mat. In this example, we will cut a V-groove 1/2 inch from a 6x9 opening in an 11x14 mat. The opening will create 2.5 inch borders. Therefore, the V-groove will be cut 2 inches from the edges. Set the mat guide and measuring stops to produce a 2-inch border and cut out an opening as you did when cutting a single mat. Notice how the slip sheet is moved between cuts. Set the mat and fallout aside. Slide the measuring stops out of the way and loosen the small knurled thumb knob that locks the mat stop. Slide the mat stop into the mat guide so it no longer protrudes and lock it in this position. Loosen both mat guide locking knobs and slide the mat guide to the right far enough so you can insert the locator pin in the 4th hole from the left. Now slide the mat guide back to the left until it rests against the locator pin and lock it in place with its locking knobs. Place the fallout right side up against the mat guide. Use a small strip of beveled mat prepared in advance and place it against the mat guide and the upper edge of your fallout with their bevels fitted together. Depress the clamp handle. Slide the cutting head beyond the small strip. Rotate the bevel cutting blade and pull the cutting head to a position well below the mat. The spare strip provided the blade a smooth entry into the fallout. Notice how you have removed a sliver of the fallout. Rotate the fallout 90 degrees counterclockwise and repeat this cut with a fresh strip of lead-in mat. Do this 2 more times. Lay the mat face down on the table. Place 2 strips of 3M 810 tape on opposite sides as shown. Turn the mat over so it is face up. Note where the pencil mark is on the back. Place the fallout in the opening so the pencil marks line up as they did before cutting. Now turn the mat upside down again and tape the other 2 joints with permanent transparent tape. Turn the mat over to see your V-groove. Loosen the mat guide locking knobs. Remove the locator pin. Slide the mat guide to the left. Place the locator pin in the 3rd hole from the right for 2.5 inches. Slide the mat guide against the locator pin and tighten the mat guide locking knobs. Loosen the mat stop knob and slide it out of the mat guide and retighten. Set the measuring stops for a 2.5 inch border and cut out the opening as before. The width of the groove can be changed by repositioning the hex screw on the left side of the mat guide. If you turn it clockwise to increase the width, be careful not to overdo it or the groove will become a gap. Turn the screw counterclockwise to make the groove narrower. Rotate the blade barely far enough to trim the sliver. Fully rotated, the blade may hit the mat guide. The second technique is as follows. With the mat guide and measuring stops set for a 2-inch border, cut 2 opposite sides and remove the mat. Apply 3M 810 tape to the 2 joints on the back of the mat. Reposition the mat against the mat guide and cut the 3rd and 4th sides. Remove the mat and tape the last 2 sides on the back. Place the mat back in the machine right side up and against the mat guide and mat stop. Without readjusting the mat guide position, make 4 cuts on the face of the mat, rotating the bevel blade only enough to remove a sliver. Start and stop the cuts at the cuts produced from the back of the mat. You want to avoid cutting all the way through. Reset the mat guide and measuring stops for a 2.5-inch border and cut the opening as you did before. The components of the squaring arm option, squaring arm with scale, brace, and squaring arm stop, should be removed from the shipping tube. An instruction sheet is included which will assist you in the installation. Screws and nuts are in the parts bag. Remove the button head screw, which is pre-installed on the right edge of the base about 40 inches from the lower end. Leave the nut in place. Attach the bracket at the end of the brace with the button head screw just removed. Tighten slightly. Insert a flathead screw in the hole in the left end of the squaring arm, then the hole in the base. Add a washer, lock washer, and nut, but only finger tight. Place a flathead screw through the squaring arm, the brace, and into the eccentric nut. Be sure the nut is seated in the hole in the brace. If you turn this nut with your fingers, you will see the squaring arm rotate on the base. Leave the eccentric nut with the squaring arm in the middle of its up and down motion. Now tighten all 3 screws. To complete the installation, you will have to align the squaring arm so it is exactly 90 degrees to the line of cutting. This is usually called squaring. Place a full-size foam board with a long side against the squaring arm. This edge of the board must be straight. Slide the board to the left as though you are going to cut it in the middle. Using the straight blade, make 2 short cuts, one at the bottom and the other at the top of the foam board. Turn the board upside down with the same bottom edge against the squaring arm. Position it so the straight blade fits back into the bottom cut. Move the cutting head to the top of the board and make a short cut. Compare this cut to the one produced from the other side. If it is to the right of the first one, the squaring arm needs to be lowered. To the left, it needs to be raised. Loosen the screw in the eccentric nut and turn the nut until the blade touches the board exactly halfway between the 2 upper cuts. Tighten the screw and check the results with a new set of cuts near the first. If the eccentric nut could not move the mat up or down far enough, loosen the button head screw at the upper end of the brace and slide the brace to a position where you can make the adjustment with the eccentric nut. The scale in the squaring arm is loose and needs to be positioned and fastened. Make a pencil mark 3 inches from the left edge of a mat board. Slide the scale to the right several inches out of the squaring arm. Twist the scale and remove the protective paper from the double-sided tape on the underside of the scale. Rotate the vertical cutting blade on the right side of the head and slide the mat board on the squaring arm so it just touches the blade. Slide the scale so its 3-inch index mark lines up exactly with the pencil line on the mat. Now press down on the right end of the scale and it will re-adhere to the squaring arm. A detent plunger on the right side of the head locks the vertical cutting blade in its full down position. It is activated by turning the plunger 1/4 turn. At the end of the cut, push the detent and the blade returns to its upward position. If you do not want to use this feature, push the plunger knob in and rotate 1/4 turn again and the blade will not lock down. The optional angle mat guide permits you to cut multiple angled corners in a mat opening. This option is extremely flexible and its versatility is limited only by your imagination. A typical application is to cut an 8-sided opening. The corner cuts cannot be defined as mat borders, so their location is dictated by the aesthetics of the mat and size and shape of the artwork. Set the angle mat guide on top of the mat guide and move it to the left until it rests against a rib on the underside. You can select one of 3 different positions to lock the guide in place as determined by the 3 holes in a line. For a small mat, use the left hole. Now slide the angle mat guide toward the near end of the mat guide. When it stops, rotate the eccentric locking knob and the angle mat guide will be locked in place. Large mats require more room on the base, so the right hole can be used and the angle mat guide will be locked nearer the upper end of the mat guide. Loosen the angle locking knob and notice each angle arm can rotate independently of the other. Place a corner of the mat against the 2 angle arms. Rotate the mat and the arms until the index arrow reads 45 on both arm scales. Lock the angle locking knob in this position. Remove the angle mat guide and set it aside. Lock the mat guide at 1.5 inches and pencil the 4 lines for straight cuts. Place the angle mat guide back on the mat guide and lock it in place. Lock the mat guide at 3 inches. Place each corner of the mat in the angle mat guide and make pencil lines that cross the parallel lines previously drawn. Now cut the 4 angled borders, starting and stopping at the intersecting lines. The measuring stops are not practical to use with this example because the intersection of cuts occur at uncertain locations. Remove the angle mat guide. Reset the mat guide to 1.5 inches and cut the 4 straight sides of the opening. Again, you will use the angled pencil lines to start and stop. It is a good idea to practice so you can create corners without undercuts or excessive overcuts. The optional Fletcher 2100 clamp lifters are convenient devices which hold the clamp slightly off the base to make it easy to rotate or insert a mat to be cut. It frees up both your hands so you can handle a very large mat without holding the clamp handle. The lifters are mounted on the underside of the clamp brackets and held in place by thumb screws. Mount one lifter about 3.5 inches from the handlebar at the lower end of the machine. Mount the other lifter about 4 inches from the handlebar at the far end. The mounting thumb screws should be facing away from you. Once installed, the lifters automatically hold the clamp about 1/4 inch above the slip sheet. When you press down on the clamp handle, the unique design of the springs in the lifters permits the clamp to lay flat. When you next lift the clamp handle, it will stay above the base by itself. The most important maintenance requirement of the Fletcher 2100 is to keep it clean. Cutting mat board, like any paper product, generates paper dust and small scrap pieces. It is a good idea, therefore, to keep a clean cloth or draftsman's brush near the machine so you can clean exposed parts of the machine, especially the clamp, shaft, and head several times during the day. Occasionally, you can apply a small amount of lighter fluid to a clean cloth to wipe the shaft and clamp. Be sure to wipe it dry to remove any residual fluid. Inspect the underside of the clamp and use adhesive release to remove any ATG adhesive that may have accumulated. It is wise to keep the machine covered when not in use. Paper debris will sometimes stick to the head bearings, causing a rumbling noise. It can be cleaned by removing the head, but a simple technique is quicker. Lay a strip of 3M 811 transparent tape upside down on the clamp where the head bearings roll. Anchor it at both ends with a short piece of tape. Slowly roll the head over the tape, and the debris will be transferred to the tape, which is discarded. Although the Fletcher 2100 is shipped with all adjustments factory inspected, you need to know how to do them yourself because with time and heavy use by different operators, some adjustments may have to be checked or even changed. The head should not be loose on the shaft and clamp. If it rotates on the shaft, correct it by tightening the set screw on top of the head. Slide the head back and forth on the shaft while tightening the screw. At the first sign of binding, Loosen the screw 1/2 turn. Do not over-tighten the screw. Bushings in the head provide a smooth fit on the shaft. They can be adjusted by tightening the 2 set screws on the right side of the head. Adjust each of them the same way as the set screw on the top of the head. Slide the head on the shaft while tightening the set screw. Loosen the screw 1/4 turn as soon as you detect binding. The most important adjustment is called squaring. Actually, this is a misnomer, since the purpose is to assure that the mat guide is exactly parallel to the cuts. Lock the mat guide at a convenient setting of about 2 inches. Place a small piece of mat under the clamp at the lower end of the mat guide. Make a light cut about 2 inches long near the lower part of the mat. Move the mat to the far end of the mat guide and make another light cut, which starts beyond the first cut and runs into it. Remove the mat and bend it so you can see if the 2 cuts coincide perfectly or if they are offset from one another. If they are offset, correction is required. Loosen the locking knobs on the mat guide and the 2 screws in the top of the mat guide slide. Place the squaring blocks between the shaft and the mat guide, one near the bottom of the mat guide and the other near the top. Hold normal downward pressure on the clamp handle with your left forearm. With your left hand in the middle of the mat guide, push it to the right until it touches both squaring blocks. Continue to hold the mat guide tightly against the blocks while tightening the lower locking knob. Then tighten the 2 screws in the mat guide slide, the left screw first, then the right one. Do not tighten the upper locking knob on the mat guide during this procedure. Remove the squaring blocks and make another test to verify the mat guide has been properly adjusted. An alternative method is to cut through the mat from the back without cutting all the way to the edges. Tape this cut, turn the mat face up with the same settings, make a light cut on the front, free the strip at both ends. If it appears to be uniform in width, the mat guide is in proper adjustment. Lock the mat guide at 2 inches using the locator pin. Cut a strip from the edge of a mat. Measure this mat border to be sure it is exactly 2 inches. If it is not, you will have to adjust the hex cap screw on the right side of the mat guide that rests against the locator pin. If the mat border is less than 2 inches, turn the screw counterclockwise. Conversely, if the border is more than 2 inches, the screw must be turned clockwise. Retest after adjustments are made to be sure of the results. If the indicator on the mat guide does not read exactly 2 inches, loosen the Phillips head screw and move the indicator until it does. If changes were made to square the mat guide, you must readjust the measuring stops as described earlier. When the magazine is removed from the bevel and straight side of the head, a pivot screw can be accessed. These screws should always be tight. If it should ever be necessary to remove the head, the following procedure is followed. Remove both magazines. Loosen the set screw on top of the head 1 or 2 turns. Remove the hex head bolt and spring washer from the lower end of the shaft. Remove the 2 button head screws from the lower hinge bracket, which holds the shaft bracket, and slip the shaft bracket off the shaft. Lift the clamp handle just enough to slide the head off the shaft. Hold your hand under the head to keep a bearing from falling free. Reverse this procedure to reinstall the head. The optional base plate is installed according to the instructions provided with it. It increases the width of the base and makes it much easier to cut multiple openings because the mat guide slide length is doubled. This 24 by 30 mat with 13 openings was cut using the mat guide on all but the center openings. Please remove the warranty from the owner's manual. Fill it out and return the white copy within 1 week of purchase to validate your guarantee. Keep the owner's manual and the components from the parts bag near the machine so they are always accessible for reference. If you have any problems you cannot resolve with the manual, please call your distributor or the Fletcher Terry Company at the phone number in the owner's manual. You can now join the legion of framers who own and appreciate the quality and ease of use of the Fletcher 2100 professional mat cutter. Your customers will recognize the creativity of the mats you can now produce.